think we can start now. Hello everyone, it's nice to see you all after, it's been a while since I've seen most of you actually. I hope you all had a really good break between semesters. And so today I'm starting with a new series of lectures, Pharmacology and Translation. So this is a series of lectures more about the sort of pharmaceutical industry, a bit of clinical pharmacology, clinical trials and that sort of thing. So to give you an idea of maybe some of the industry kind of useful information if you ever go into industry, that sort of thing. So hopefully you guys find this informative and useful and interesting. So today I'm just going to start off by giving a brief history of the pharmaceutical industry and then looking at what it's like today, the current state of it. And I'm going to finish off today by looking at some of the main regulatory bodies that are involved in the regulating the pharmaceutical industry, which I'm sure you know a little bit about already. And so these are the learning objectives for today's lecture. Okay, so starting off with a bit of an overview of the history of the pharmaceutical industry. So it kind of first started developing in the mid-1800s and it arose from two main industries. So the first was small apothecaries, which are basically little chemists or pharmacists in those days. So they were making sort of small scale medicines and they started to move up into making more wholesale production of drugs. So you'll recognise a lot of these companies already. So Merck was a small company that began in 1668 and sort of a couple of hundred years later they moved into wholesale drug production. Of course they're still a really big drug company today. And some of the others as well you'll be familiar with, Hoffmann La Roche, maybe Burroughs Wellcome, Abbott, Eli Lilly, I think it's just called Lilly these days. So the other industry that sort of evolved into the pharmaceutical industry was dye and other chemical companies. So they weren't actually making medicines to begin with, but some of them discovered that there was actually medical applications for the chemicals that they were making. And so examples of that is Bayer and Sandoz and Pfizer. So you can see that a lot of these big pharmaceutical companies that are still around today have been around for a very long time. Some of them always in medicine, some not so. But so that's sort of where it was all starting, the mid-1800s. So in the first few decades of the 1900s, there were some really big discoveries in pharmacology. So the first was adrenaline and noradrenaline and its use for treating asthma and also in nasal congestion. Of course, amphetamine was discovered in this period too. It was originally used for nasal congestion. You can see over here, this is a benzodrine inhaler for nasal congestion. And later on, it was used for treating narcolepsy and mood elevation. Barbiturates were developed during this time for treatment of insomnia and epilepsy. And insulin was discovered and the role insulin played in diabetes as well. And of course, this was a life-changing discovery for people with diabetes. And one of the biggest and most important pharmaceutical discoveries, penicillin. So the use of penicillin to treat bacterial infections. So you can see here, this is Alexander Fleming with one of his penicillin molds. Of course, penicillin and antibiotics have really revolutionised the treatment of bacterial infections. Here you can see, sorry, I forgot to show you, this is one of the first patients treated with insulin and an insulin bottle. So. Okay, so that was the first few decades of the 1900s. Then moving more from the 1930s to the 1960s, there was a lot of breakthroughs in the pharmaceutical industry and ones that were particularly significant which led to reduction in infant deaths. So you can see this graph here from sort of the 1910s. There was just an enormous reduction from right down to very, very little infant mortality rate in these days, in the current days. So, and of course, one of the major drivers for this reduction in infant mortality was antibiotics. So, streptomycin, erythromycin, tetracycline. This allowed children to be treated for these infections and recover from diseases that once upon a time they would die from. And the other major driver was, of course, vaccines for really serious diseases that were once often fatal for children and adults as too, but definitely more commonly in children. So diphtheria, influenza, polio. Once vaccines came in for these, this had a huge role in reducing the mortality rate of children. Some other breakthroughs in the pharmaceutical industry during this period were like endogenous hormones that could be developed and used to treat diseases. So thyroxine, oxytocin, corticosteroids. This period really saw a big breakthrough in the development of psychotropics. So the monoamine inhibitors, thorazine, haloperidol. So a lot of work going on looking at psychotropics in this period, and also cardiovascular drugs. So this was the first stages, the first sort of classes of these cardiovascular drugs, which are still in use today, the diuretics and the beta blockers. Antihistamines were discovered and developed, and of course the contraceptive pill, which you can see here. Okay, so the other thing that happened during this period was that there was a couple of really significant pharmaceutical tragedies, I guess, which caused there to be increased regulations within the pharmaceutical industry. So before these happened, there was limited regulation in the way pharmaceuticals were marketed and to patients. So the first one of these was sulfonamide, the sulfonamide disaster happened in 1937. So sulfonamide is an antibiotic, and in the production process of it uses diethylene glycol, which is toxic. And unfortunately, the diethylene glycol was still at toxic levels when it was in the medicine, and so this was a medicine mostly given to children as well, as it was a liquid antibiotic, and so over 100 people died, and most of them were children. So it was a very tragic disaster. The only good thing to come out of it was that it led to the establishment of the 1938 Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, which expanded the Federal Drug Authority's administration's authority over marketing of new drugs. And then in the 50s and 60s, some of you may have already heard of the thalidomide disaster. So thalidomide was used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. And unfortunately, nobody realised at the time that it was actually tetragenic, meaning that it led to thousands of miscarriages in these pregnant women, and then also the babies that didn't miscarriage would go on to be born with very severe deformities often. So over 10,000 children were born with these deformities. You can see here is a picture of one of these babies here. So because of this terrible disaster that happened with so many people and babies affected, this led to new FDA regulations which required proof of efficacy and safety, and that all side effects had to be disclosed to patients and to the FDA. And importantly, this was not just on new drugs that were going to the FDA, but also on all existing drugs. So it was quite, it required a lot of work to get existing drugs as well as new drugs to get to this level of regulation. But it's a really important thing that happened so that we can have more faith in the safety of our drugs today. Okay, so that was the 30s up to the 60s. So the last 3 decades of the 20th century, we saw more drug development. So the next generation of cardiovascular drugs, the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, calcium channel blockers, statins, lots of new cancer drugs being developed, especially towards the end of the 20th century, SSRIs as well. And there continued to be more improved standardisation, oversight and regulation by the FDA, as well as other regulatory bodies as well. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about all these regulatory bodies at the end of towards the end of the lecture. And the other thing that was really happening during this period was an improvement to the drug discovery processes. So there was a lot more rational design going around drug discovery. So using the structure-activity relationships between a drug and its target, or knowing the target and then using the structure-activity relationships to develop optimized compounds. And this rational design was really strengthened by new instrumentation that was coming out. So nuclear magnetic resonance, high pressure liquid chromatography, high throughput screening, things like that really allowed for improved drug discovery processes. And of course, computers, because in the early 70s, in the 1970s, computers were really still in their infancy. And by the end of the century, they could do very complex calculations, modelling. So this has really improved the way drug discovery can be done, certainly during this period. The other thing that was happening in the industry during this time was merging of a lot of the pharmaceutical companies. So I already mentioned a few of them at the beginning of the lecture. So there was lots of smaller pharmaceutical companies, and then during this period a lot of them merged into sort of big, larger pharmaceutical companies. And you see that still happens today, that they merge or they split and then they merge again, so it's still ongoing. So the 21st century, so really this started off with the sequencing of the human genome, and being able to do that and being able to do it at the really low cost rates that we can now do it today, a couple of decades later, has really revolutionised the way the pharmaceutical industry works. Obviously we can compare genomes of individuals affected with a disease as compared to unaffected diseases. This allows us to understand the underlying etiology of diseases, what's causing diseases, and what the potential drug target might be when we want to develop a drug for a disease. It also leads us to the fields of pharmacogenomics and personalised medicine. So I'm not sure how much of a background you guys have in this already, but you will have a few lectures on it, I think in a few weeks' time. So pharmacogenomics is basically the concept that people will have different pharmacodynamic or different pharmacokinetic responses to particular drugs. So for example, the drug, they might take a drug and it binds to its target, and different people, because of different mutations in that drug target, will respond differently to that drug. Or the enzyme that metabolizes that drug, different mutations that people have in that enzyme will mean that they metabolize the drug differently. So that's the kind of underlying idea behind pharmacogenomics. And the idea going forwards is to use that information to develop personalised medicine. So basically using people's genomes to determine what kind of medicine that you give them. So for example, some people might need a smaller dose of a drug, or some people need a larger dose of a drug. And some people, that drug might actually not work for them, even though it's the same condition. So you would potentially give them a different drug. So that's sort of going to be a really huge part of the pharmaceutical industry going forward. It's already really growing and evolving, but I think over the next decade or two, it's really going to be a huge part of the pharmaceutical industry. Again, still kind of in the genomics field is CRISPR-Cas9 and gene therapy. So this is being able to actually use the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology to change either, if a person has a gene for a protein that has some kind of mutation in it that makes it less functional or too functional, or it can't express, or it has something wrong with the protein as a result of a mutation in the gene from the protein, then the idea is that we can use gene editing technology like CRISPR-Cas9 to go in and either, or you could delete a gene, you could insert a gene, you could just alter some of the bases in that gene. So there's a lot of different things that could be done using gene editing technology like CRISPR-Cas9 to develop gene therapies, and there's a lot of this happening already for some medicines. So, also the rise of biological medicines as opposed to sort of chemical medicines. I'm not going to really talk about that today because you actually have a lecture from Phil about it at the end of the week, so I'll let him go into that a bit more. So the current state of the pharmaceutical sector, it's probably not surprising that it's pretty big. This is a little bit outdated here, so this is from 2019. You can see it was the 9th biggest industry in the world that year, and I imagine it's still fairly similar. I just thought this was a little bit interesting to look at the world's 100 biggest companies and see how many of them are pharmaceutical companies, or health-based companies at least. So obviously there's the big tech companies, which are enormous, and Amazon as well down here. And the ones in blue are the health companies, so it's kind of hard to see. You've got Johnson & Johnson here, Pfizer, Lilly, there's Roche up there. So they're reasonable sized companies, and there's certainly a lot of them in the world's 100 biggest companies. So it's a big sector, obviously. And this is just looking at all of the pharmaceutical companies in the world and the size of the circle tells you how much the company is worth. So North America has a lot of really big pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Lilly, AbbVie. Europe as well has some big ones, Roche, Novartis, AstraZeneca, Novo Nordisk. The pharmaceutical industry in Asia is a little bit smaller, but there's still some big ones there, Takeda, Oceania. So we have one in Australia, but it's still reasonable size, so CSL. So if any of you are looking to go into the pharmaceutical industry, the biggest option in Australia is CSL. There's a lot of work over in Sydney, I think in Melbourne, they have offices as well. So if that's a sort of area that you're interested in going to, then there are options within Australia too. Okay, so classification of pharmaceutical products. So historically there were just chemical compounds. So these are usually small to medium-sized molecules, and they're synthesized by combining chemical ingredients in fixed proportions. So that's the sort of drugs and medicines that we're most familiar with. But as I said, over the past couple of decades, biological medicines have started developing. So these are things that tend to be much larger size. So you can see here the comparison between Lipitor, which is still a fairly largish molecule, compared to Herceptin, which is a huge molecule. And biologics are manufactured in a living system. So that could be within a microorganism or a plant or animal cells. And as I said, biologics are usually very large molecules, or they may even be complex mixtures, mixtures of molecules. So they're quite different in terms of the way they're manufactured. And then below that classification level is the difference between brand name medicines and generic medicines. So you're probably pretty familiar with these concepts already. And I will talk a little bit more about the concept of patenting in the next lecture as well. So brand name medicines, they are still covered by their patent protection. So they can only be produced and marketed by the company that holds that patent. Whereas once a patent expires, then generic medicines can be produced. So these are medicines that have the same active ingredient and have been shown to be bioequivalent, but they can be produced by a different company. And it's a similar concept as well for biologics. So patented biologics can only be produced and marketed by the company that holds the patent. And again, once that patent runs out for biologics, then bioequivalent versions can be produced by other manufacturers. Okay, so this is just to show you sort of numbers of drugs that are being approved by the FDA and how it's changed over several decades. So you can see that there was quite a lull in drug approvals over sort of the early 2000s, and that's really started to increase. And that's not just because we are seeing an increase in numbers in terms of approved chemical drugs, but also you can see the numbers in biologics are also increasing as well. So overall there's been a lot of increases in drug approvals by the FDA. Okay, so now moving on to the regulatory bodies. So the biggest and probably the most well known is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. This is obviously the regulatory body in the USA, but it's also the regulatory body that a lot of the other world's regulatory bodies kind of look to see what they are doing in terms of approvals and medicines. So the FDA is responsible for protecting public health by ensuring safety, efficacy and security of human and also veterinary drugs, as well as biological products and medical devices. So you'll find that different regulatory bodies will cover slightly different things. So they won't all cover veterinary drugs, for example. But the FDA is also responsible for the safety of food supply, cosmetics and products that emit radiation. So they ensure that claims that are made by a medical product accurately reflect the risks and benefits of that product, and specify what marketing claims that they can make as well. So the Centre for Drug Evaluation and Research is the centre that evaluates drugs before they can be sold. And so there's a whole pile of scientists and people that review the company's data and what they are proposing to put on the labelling of a medicine. And the FDA has to decide if an independent and unbiased review of the benefits outweighs the known risks of a drug, because as we know, nearly all drugs are going to have side effects of some kind. So if the benefits outweigh the risks, then the FDA will approve it for sale. So the approvals process. So this includes analysis of the target condition as well as current available treatments, and then assessment of benefits and risks from the clinical data that the manufacturer or the supplier provides, and also strategies for managing those risks. So we need to be able to know that the product is at least as good as what's already on the market, if not better, at treating the indicated condition. And there are instances where accelerated approval may occur if a drug can provide life-saving therapy and is superior to current drugs on the market. I think we all remember the COVID vaccines got accelerated approval by the FDA. So this approach obviously allows for approval of the drug, and that it demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. So that might not be a definite endpoint, but a surrogate endpoint. So a drug may receive fast-track approval if it meets the following criteria. So if the drug is intended to treat a serious condition, the drug has a potential to address an unmet clinical need, and the drug is for a serious life-threatening condition. I'm going to repeat myself there. Okay, so that was the FDA, and now onto the TGA. So a much smaller regulatory body, but much more relevant to us. So obviously the TGA is the Australian regulatory body, and it's responsible for regulating the supply, the import and the export, as well as manufacturing and advertising of therapeutic goods. So the therapeutic goods that are regulated by the TGA are medicines. So these are prescription medicines, over-the-counter, and also complementary medicines. So examples, paracetamol or echinacea. They are also responsible for regulating biologics. So as I said, these are medicines that are manufactured in a living system. And they also regulate medical devices. So instruments, implants, appliances, such as pacemakers and sterile bandages. Okay, so the regulation of medicines by the TGA includes the following features: classifying the medicine based on different levels of risk to the person taking them, implementing appropriate regulatory controls for the manufacturing process of medicines, medicines assessed as having a higher level of risk. So these are things like prescription medicines as well as some non-prescription medicines. They're evaluated for quality, safety and efficacy, whereas ingredients in medicines with a lower risk, so these could be over-the-counter or complementary medicines, these are only assessed for quality and safety, so they're not assessed for efficacy. So that's a really important difference between them. And once available for supply, medicines are subject to continuous monitoring by the TGA. And this monitoring includes a comprehensive adverse event reporting program. So the TGA has what is known as the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, the ARTG. So basically this classifies medicines into two different classes based on the level of risk or So registered products are considered to be high risk medicines and they must be registered by that ARTG. And the registration involves individually evaluating the quality, safety and effectiveness of the product. So registered products are labelled with an OST-R number. So if you go have a look at a box of medicine that you might have, you'll see that at the bottom it has either an OST-R number or it might have a OST-L number if it's not registered. So all prescription medicines are registered. Most over-the-counter medicines are registered, but not all of them. And some complementary medicines are registered. So these are sort of the things to remember in terms of what kinds of medicines are and aren't registered. So in contrast to the registered medicines, or products, we have listed products. So these are lower risk medicines, and they contain pre-approved low risk ingredients, and they make limited claims on what they can actually do. So these are products that can then be listed rather than registered on the ARTG. The TGA does not individually evaluate listed medicines for quality, safety and efficacy. So they're automatically put on the ARTG based on the certification by the sponsor or the owner or the manufacturer. And they say that their medicine meets the applicable legislative requirements in relation to safety, quality and efficacy. And the TGA can undertake a compliance review of any of these medicines at any time. So no prescription medicines are listed. So that's the first thing. All of them are registered. So some over-the-counter medicines are listed and most complementary medicines are listed. So, and I can't remember if I said this already, but yeah, the OST-L number is what we find on listed medicines. Okay, so the TGA regulates medicines through pre-market approval as well as post-market monitoring and enforcement of standards, licensing of Australian manufacturers and also verifying overseas manufacturers' compliance to make sure that they have the same standards as Australian counterparts. Their approach to risk management involves identifying, assessing and evaluating the risks posed by therapeutic goods, applying any measures necessary for treating the risks posed and monitoring and reviewing risks over time. And the risks involved with therapeutic goods are divided into two types. So you can have product risks, which are risks inherent to the product itself, or there is a compliant risk, which are risks involved if the manufacturer fails to comply with legal requirements. So something is going below safety standards, for example, in the manufacturing process. Okay, and the last one is the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. So this is obviously regulates pharmaceuticals in the European Union, and their mission is to foster scientific excellence in the evaluation and supervision of medicines for the benefit of public and animal health in the EU. And roles are to facilitate development and access to medicines, evaluate applications for marketing authorization, monitor the safety of medicines across their life cycle and provide information to healthcare professionals and patients. Okay, that's it for today. I think I finished up pretty quickly, so you guys have a nice quick lecture. You can have an early lunch. Yeah, all right, that's it. So I will see you tomorrow. Nice to see you all again. Thank you. Hi.
I have some question about my timetable here.
Oh, yeah.
There are 2 weeks on my timetable show that on the Wednesday because my lab was allocated on Wednesday. It appears like something like this, but the rest of the week are just like...
Yeah, there's been some issues with timetabling and with CAS. So I think all it is that, this particular week.
This one is like, it's 11 computers.
Yeah, and it's only, so that week,
This one's for the web lab. Also, it's always also there.
So yeah, there's just a problem with CAS, and I don't know if they're going to fix it.
I just ignored it, like...
Yeah, it's just, I mean, you're still either way. I can't remember what's happening that week, if it's a wet lab or a dry lab. But yeah, it will be, whichever one it is, you'll be made aware of, which room to go to, whether it's the wet lab or the, computer lab. So yeah, don't worry about it. It's just CAS doing something weird.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Hi. I just have a question about patented drugs. So, how you said when the patent expires, then they can make a generic version. Is that like, does that mean that they can't make a generic version with a different name until the patent's actually expired?
Well, look, they can, but then the company can sue them or, take legal action against them. So, in a developed, like somewhere in Australia or whatever, that's not going to happen, but it does happen, South America or places where the market might be small enough. But in theory, you aren't allowed to make a drug.
And how long does the patent last for as well?
So it lasts for 20 years usually. So but that's from when you first put the patent in, which is a really early stage. So by the time, it might take 15 years to get to market. I'm going. This is tomorrow's lecture. I'll go into a lot of this. Yeah. But it might be 15 years from when you put the patent in before it goes to market. So the pharmaceutical company might only have 5 years to make profits.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
These lectures are a nice change of pace.
Yeah, it's a bit science easy, a bit less science. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.